stiff with ice. The face beneath the rim of the helmet stared up, eyes wide, mouth full of frozen snow. They called it a routine recon. There's no such thing. Not in the Ardennes, winter of 1944. My name's Lieutenant Henry Keller, 101st Airborne 502nd PIR. We were told to push out a 4-man patrol east of Foy to check reports of enemy armor massing in the pines. The brass called it a quick look-see. I called it walking into the wolf's den with a candle. The men chosen with me were ones I'd trusted since Holland. Sergeant Ray Hutchins, broad-shouldered Missouri farm boy with a grin that could steady nerves. Corporal Eddie Malone, wiry Boston street kid who carried his bar like it was part of him. Private First Class Tommy Reed, the youngest, 19, too earnest for war, still wrote letters home every night. We stepped off just after dusk, the sky a sheet of dirty steel. Snow fell in soft, deceptive silence, the kind that looks peaceful until you notice it swallows all sound. Every crunch of our boots felt criminal. Hutchins muttered, "Feels like the woods are listening." I didn't answer because I felt it too. You do enough patrols, you learn that some silences feel alive. We moved single file along a narrow deer track, weapons slung low, white breath curling from our scarves. Visibility was barely 50 yards. The fog rising off the snow blurred the tree line into ghost shapes. By the time we reached the ridge overlooking the river crossing, daylight had bled out entirely. We crouched in the tree line, scanning through drifting snow for any sign of armor or troop movement. The river below looked frozen solid, the current trapped beneath a glassy crust that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. No tracks, no bridges, no campfires, just a ribbon of silver twisting between black pine trunks. Malone shifted his bar and whispered, "Could be they moved at first light. Maybe command's late to the party again." I hushed him with a gesture. Not because I disagreed, but because I'd noticed something strange. The snow on the far bank was broken as if something heavy had pressed down the drifts, then melted back into the river. Too wide for a fox, too light for a truck. We stayed another hour in that tree line, teeth chattering, waiting for anything to move. Nothing did. No tracks appeared, no voices, not even a crow. Finally, I tapped Hutchins' shoulder. "Another 100 yards east. If we find nothing, we double back." We skirted the ridge until the trees thickened and the moon disappeared behind cloud. The dark there felt different, heavier somehow, like the air itself had weight. That's when Reed slipped. His foot punched through a snow-covered hole, jarring a muffled metallic clank below. The sound shot through us like a bullet. Malone hissed, "Booby trap!" I crouched beside Reed's leg, shining my shuttered torch downward for half a second, just enough to see a half-buried helmet. Not German issue. Ours. We cleared snow carefully with our gloves. Underneath lay the upper edge of a frozen greatcoat, a U.S. infantry coat, stiff with ice. The face beneath the rim of the helmet stared up, eyes wide, mouth full of frozen snow. No blast wound, no blood, just the stillness of someone who'd been caught by the elements or worse. Reed swallowed hard. "Sir, he's one of ours." The snow hid the rest of the body. We could see only a single gloved hand curled tight as if holding something. I couldn't bring myself to pry it open. Not yet. Hutchins looked at me, voice low but steady. "Sir, that means this ain't recon anymore. This is recovery." I nodded, but in my gut I knew we weren't recovering anything. We just stumbled on a secret the forest had been ordered to keep. For another 10 minutes we scraped, finding 2 more shapes half buried side by side under the crusted drift. Both wore American patches, both frozen stiff, no sign of struggle. Their rifles were still slung across their backs, safeties on. We should have turned back right then, radioed it in and waited for daylight. But I made the call to press farther east, to see if we could find where the rest of their unit had gone. That decision still keeps me awake 79 winters later, because that was the night we started following the trail of the Ghost Patrol. The night 4 living men went hunting for the truth behind 6 frozen ones. We didn't talk much after finding those frozen men. Words felt too loud in that forest. We pushed east along the ridge, single file. The snow came down in finer flakes now, drifting sideways on a thin wind that whistled through the pine tops. Every branch sagged beneath its white burden. Sometimes a clump would fall with a soft thud and all of us would flinch as if it were a grenade. Sergeant Hutchins led, his big frame hunched forward, bar cradled in both arms. I brought up the rear, eyes on the track we left in the snow, a thin dotted line that felt too permanent. In these woods you wanted to be a ghost, not leave a trail for anything to follow. An hour in, we found the first sign that the men we had uncovered were not alone. Hutchins raised a fist and knelt. Ahead of him, on the low slope leading to a frozen creek, the snow was churned up. Boot prints. Not just ours. Not fresh enough to shine, but not yet filled by new snow either. A dozen pairs at least, all heading west, deeper into the timber. Corporal Malone crouched to study the trail, bar barrel resting on his knee. Could be retreating Germans, he whispered. I shook my head. No heel drag. Wide spacing. Whoever they were marching in good order. We crossed the creek where the ice was thick enough to hold. Reed slipped once, cursing under his breath, and I steadied him by the strap of his pack. He muttered thanks, but didn't look me in the eye. His jaw worked like he was chewing on a question he didn't dare ask. Another mile brought us to an abandoned dugout half hidden by fallen branches. The entrance was crusted with ice. The interior smelled of cold earth and rust. Inside we found 2 empty ammo tins, an overturned stove, and a single boot still laced. No footprints leaving in any direction. Only the same westward trail we had been following. Malone said quietly, feels like we're behind them but not catching up. Like they're right out of sight on purpose. No one answered. We all felt it. Near dusk we set up a hasty observation post on a low rise. Hutchins pulled the map from his breast pocket, wiped the damp from its surface, and checked our grid. Command thinks this sector's clear, he said. His tone suggested he no longer trusted what Command thought. Reed finally spoke, voice tight. Sir, the men we found, what do you think happened to them? Frostbite wouldn't freeze a man mid-stride like that. I wanted to tell him it was exposure, plain and simple, that the cold can kill, faster than bullets if you let it. But the truth was harder. Their eyes had been open, their hands clenched. They looked surprised, not frozen asleep, and that image stuck under my ribs like a splinter. We stayed quiet after that. The woods darkened early, the light draining out of the sky until the trees were black silhouettes. The temperature dropped so fast the air felt brittle. That night we dug shallow snow pits for cover and huddled shoulder to shoulder under our ponchos. Hutchins sat first watch, his silhouette barely a darker shadow against the white haze. Every so often the ice on the creek cracked with a muffled boom, echoing between the hills. It sounded like distant artillery and set my teeth on edge. Sometime after midnight I woke to the faint murmur of voices. At first I thought it was the others whispering in their sleep, but when I lifted my head I saw Hutchins staring into the trees, rifle half raised. He had heard it too. Low, distant, almost carried on the wind, a cadence too steady for nature. We both stayed frozen in place, listening. The murmur faded, replaced by the sigh of wind through the pine needles. Whatever it was had passed. Or it wanted us to think so. Just before dawn, snow began again, heavier, thick, wet flakes that stuck to our faces and rifles. The world shrank to a pale gray circle no more than 20 yards across. The footprints we had followed the day before were already half erased. As we packed up to move, Malone muttered, "We're chasing shadows, Lieutenant. I've got a bad feeling we're the ones being chased." I told him to keep his voice down, but I could not shake the same thought. We moved out, silent except for the crunch of boots. Somewhere behind us lay 6 frozen men who had once walked this same path. Ahead waited the rest of their patrol, if any of them were still alive to be found. By mid-morning the snow had stopped again, leaving the forest wrapped in a cold hush that felt heavier than any gunfire. Our breath came out in little clouds that drifted sideways, vanishing into the gray air. Every man was thinking the same thing, but no one dared voice it. We were walking into the footprints of men who had already disappeared. The ridge sloped downward toward a shallow valley choked with pines. Each tree trunk looked almost black against the white ground, the bark slick with frozen mist. Here the footprints we had been tracking split, half veered north, half east, then merged again at the far end of the clearing. It was as if the patrol we followed had wandered in circles before picking a direction. Reed frowned at the pattern. Either they were lost, he said, or someone was leading them. We crossed the clearing one at a time, rifles high, scanning the tree line. The snow muffled our steps, but also our sense of distance. It was hard to judge how far sound carried. At the center of the clearing, we found the remains of a small fire pit. No flames now, just blackened stones buried under a crust of ice. Hutchins squatted beside it, brushing snow away with the back of his glove. He held up a scrap of wool sleeve he found frozen into the ashes. It looked torn, as though someone had ripped it free in a struggle. Fresh enough to matter, he muttered. We moved on without a word. Past the clearing, the pines grew dense again, crowding close so that their branches interlocked overhead. The light dimmed to a greenish gloom. The air smelled of sap and old smoke. I remember thinking how even in winter the forest seemed alive, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. An hour later, we came upon something none of us were prepared for. A helmet wedged in the crook of a tree branch 6 feet off the ground. It was American issue, rim cracked as if struck by a blow. Inside the rim, dried blood had turned dark and flaked. Malone reached for it but stopped short, his hand hovering. "Feels wrong to touch it," he said quietly. I nodded. We left it where it hung, a silent marker of the man who once wore it. Further in, the trail descended to a frozen stream. Here the snow told another story. Boot tracks scuffed into wild patterns, deep gouges in the ice as if men had slipped or struggled. At the base of a birch tree lay an entrenching tool half buried in frost. Its handle was splintered, one edge bent and smeared with something that wasn't just rust. Hutchins said nothing, only set his jaw and waved us forward. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of lead and the forest darkened though the sun hadn't set. We found a stretch of broken wire tangled in the brush, lengths of field telephone line torn apart. The copper ends were still shiny, not yet dulled by weather. Someone had cut it recently. Reed shifted uneasily beside me. Why cut your own line unless you're trying to go off the grid? The snow began again. Not gentle this time, but in thick clumps that clung to our jackets and helmets. The world shrank down to a narrow tunnel of white and black trunks. Visibility fell to barely 20 yards. We had to close the distance between us until we were almost shoulder to shoulder. Even then, I caught myself glancing back, half expecting someone to have vanished between one blink and the next. We stopped for a brief rest beneath an overhanging ledge where the rock jutted out like a frozen wave. No one sat. We just stood there, breathing in the silence, listening to the snow hiss as it settled. In that moment, I realized how little I knew about the men I led. Their families, their dreams before the war. All I knew was that they followed me, and that I had no promise to give them except we would keep walking. Just before we moved out, Hutchins leaned close and spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper. "Sir, I've seen battlefields quiet before a storm, but this ain't that. This is quiet like a church before a funeral." I didn't answer him. I couldn't, because the same thought had already rooted in my mind. We were not tracking a patrol anymore. We were following a procession, one that might already be marching to its own grave. By late afternoon, the wind picked up again, a thin whistle threading through the tops of the pines. It sounded almost like voices far away, carried on the cold. The snow had eased, but the gray sky pressed low and everything around us seemed carved from frost and shadow. We advanced along a narrow ridgeline where the trees thinned out. The ground beneath the snow was rocky, uneven, sometimes giving way with a brittle crunch. A few times I thought I saw shapes between the trunks ahead, only to realize they were just branches shifting in the breeze. Still, my finger stayed near the trigger. At a bend in the ridge, we found another sign of the missing patrol. A canteen half buried in snow, its strap frayed as if cut with a knife. Beside it lay the imprint of a man's knee in the frozen crust, preserved like a fossil. Malone picked up the canteen, shook it gently, and frowned at the hollow rattle. No water, no ice either, as if someone had drained it dry and tossed it aside. "Why leave your canteen?" he muttered. No one had an answer. Past the ridge, the trees opened into a bowl-shaped clearing. The snow here was disturbed, crisscrossed by boot tracks that led nowhere and everywhere. I crouched to study them. Some prints overlapped, some faced opposite directions as if the men had turned back on themselves. It looked like confusion frozen in place. Reed scanned the perimeter through his binoculars, his jaw tightening. "Feels like we're standing in the middle of a drill ground. Whoever was here wasn't just passing through." Hutchins knelt by a stump at the edge of the clearing and scraped away the snow. Underneath lay a patch of dark earth scattered with shell casings. He counted them with his thumb. "At least 2 rifles fired from here," he said. "But there's no sign of return fire. Looks like they were shooting at nothing." The remark settled over us like more snow. We pressed on, crossing the clearing in single file. The silence thickened again until all we could hear was the squeak of snow under our boots and the steady hiss of our own breathing. Then came the sound that stopped us cold. A low, dragging noise somewhere off to our right. Not quite footsteps, not quite the wind. It rose and fell in irregular pulses as though something was being hauled slowly across the ground. I raised my hand for a halt. Every man froze, rifles trained toward the noise. The sound stopped at once as if it had been listening too. We waited, listening, but the forest gave nothing back. Finally, I signaled for us to move on. We kept our formation tight, every man swiveling his head at the slightest crackle of snow. Another hour passed before the trees began to thin and the slope dipped toward what looked like the remains of an old logging camp. Half-collapsed cabins sagged under the weight of snow, their doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The smell of damp wood and mildew drifted on the air. We approached cautiously. The place looked deserted but carried a feeling of being watched. Malone tested one cabin door with his boot. It creaked open to reveal a room half filled with drifted snow. A table overturned, a broken lantern lying near the hearth. In the corner of that cabin, Hutchins found another clue. A strip of cloth tied around a rafter as though it had been used as a marker. The cloth was stained dark, stiff with old blood. Reed's expression hardened. These boys weren't just lost. They were leaving signposts. We checked 2 more cabins but found nothing except empty bunks and the wind whistling through gaps in the boards. As we regrouped near the edge of the camp, the dragging sound returned, closer now, just beyond the nearest tree line. Hutchins brought his rifle up slowly. "Tell me I'm not the only one hearing that." No one answered because we all heard it. The noise stopped again the moment we moved. That was when I felt the first real tremor of unease crawl up my spine. We were deep enough into the woods now that retreating before dark was impossible. We had no choice but to push forward, straight toward the sound that seemed to be stalking us. When we stepped back onto the trail, the last streaks of daylight were already bleeding out of the sky. Night was coming, and with it the sense that we were no longer the hunters in these woods. We decided to hold in the old logging camp rather than risk moving further in the dark. The place felt wrong, but at least the cabins gave us walls between us and the woods. Reed ordered a perimeter. Hutchins and Malone took the north edge, covering the tree line where we kept hearing the dragging sound. Carter set up near the collapsed tool shed with his bar resting across his knees. I took the first watch by the cabin with the blood-stained cloth tied to the rafter. The temperature dropped fast once the sun was gone. Our breath hung white in the glow of our flashlights. The wind carried the smell of damp wood and something else. Faint, sour like wet iron. Inside one of the cabins, Reed laid out a map on the floor and traced our route with a gloved finger. "We're here," he said, tapping a spot near the bend of a frozen stream. "The patrol's last transmission came from another 3 miles east. At first light, we head there. Until then, nobody wanders off. We stick to the buddy system." Hutchins asked the question sitting in all our minds. "You think we'll find them alive?" Reed didn't answer right away. His silence said more than words. "We'll find out in the morning," he finally said. We settled in as best we could. Malone passed around a tin of instant coffee heated over a sputtering flame from his small stove. The bitter smell mingled with the scent of mildew. We drank in silence, listening to the wind slide across the roofs and through the broken windows. Not long after midnight, the dragging sound returned. This time it circled the camp. Slow, uneven, always just beyond the range of the flashlights. I gripped my rifle tight and moved to the doorway. The others followed with their weapons raised. We stood listening, every man's eyes fixed on the darkness between the trees. The sound stopped the moment we stepped outside. Carter muttered, "Feels like it's playing with us." The rest of the night passed in uneasy shifts. Every creak of the cabins, every gust of wind against the tin roofs kept us awake. Nobody slept more than a few minutes at a time. At some point near dawn, I found myself staring at the strip of bloody cloth tied to the rafter. I wondered who had tied it there. A signal for rescue, a warning to others, or just the last thing a man could reach for before he was taken. When the first pale light slid across the clearing, we packed up quickly. The snow-covered cabins looked almost peaceful in daylight, but that was an illusion. The unease we felt had only sunk deeper into the timbers overnight. As we moved out, I looked back once. The wind stirred the ragged cloth strip so it fluttered like a small flag. I told myself it was just the breeze. Still, I had the strange sense it was seeing us off. We left the camp behind and entered the deeper woods east of the clearing. The trail narrowed again, winding between dark pines that blotted out most of the sky. The daylight faded fast, even though it was still early morning. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trail watching us go. But the only thing behind us was the line of our boot tracks filling with new snow. The woods ahead grew quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you lower your voice without realizing it. Even the crunch of snow underfoot felt too loud. Malone shifted his pack higher on his shoulders and whispered, "Feels like we're walking deeper into a mouth." No one laughed at that. We pushed on for another mile before we found the first sign that we were on the right path. A torn field dressing caught on a low branch, stiff with frozen blood. Reed pulled it free, studied it for a moment, and tucked it into his pocket. None of us spoke. We all understood it wasn't a good sign. The trees ahead thickened again, their trunks leaning close as if conspiring. Somewhere in that dark green tunnel lay the rest of the missing patrol, or what was left of them. The deeper we went, the more the trees seemed to lean inward, their branches heavy with snow that muffled even the wind. Every sound we made felt like a trespass. We found more signs of the missing squad just before noon. A boot print pressed deep into a drift where the snow was otherwise untouched. It was recent. The edges hadn't yet softened. Reed crouched to examine it, tracing the outline with his glove. They came through here, maybe only a day ahead of us. Malone glanced around the woods, uneasy. Then where the hell are they now? No one answered. We kept moving along the faint trail the missing men had left behind. A dropped bandolier half buried in slush. A broken bayonet. Another strip of field dressing tangled in brambles. Each marker felt like a breadcrumb leading us somewhere we weren't meant to go. Around mid-afternoon, we came upon a frozen creek. The ice was clear enough to see the dark water moving sluggishly beneath. Across the creek, half hidden by leaning pines, we saw what looked like a collapsed shelter made from branches and torn ponchos. Reed signaled for us to cross. The ice creaked under our weight, but held. When we reached the shelter, we found it abandoned, a small fire pit, ashes frozen into gray lumps, 3 sets of footprints leading away into the woods. Hutchins crouched near the ashes, rubbing some between his fingers. Cold. Been out at least half a day. Reed scanned the tree line. They're moving east, toward the ridge. We followed the footprints deeper into the forest. The snow grew patchier as we climbed, revealing patches of dark soil and dead leaves slick with frost. The trail led us to the base of a low ridge where the trees thinned. That was where we found the first body. He was slumped against a boulder, helmet askew, rifle across his lap. Snow had drifted against his boots. His eyes were open but glazed with frost, his face pale beneath the grime. Malone stepped forward, then stopped short. "No bullet wounds," he said softly. Reed knelt to check for signs of struggle. There were none. No tracks around the body except those that led straight to it. It was as if the soldier had simply sat down and never stood up again. We buried him under a mound of snow and branches, marked the spot with a bayonet stabbed into the ground. There was no time for words. The footprints of the other 2 continued up the ridge. The climb was slow, the snow slippery over the rocks. By the time we reached the top, the light was fading, again turning the world into a gray blur. At the crest, we found a strange sight. A narrow trench dug into the frozen soil, no longer than a man's height, lined with pine boughs. It looked like a fighting position, or a grave. Carter muttered, "This doesn't feel right." Reed's jaw tightened. "We're camping here tonight. We'll move again at first light." We set a small fire in the trench, shielding it with our packs to keep the glow low. The smoke barely rose in the damp air. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to draw closer around the ridge. The sounds we'd heard at the logging camp returned. Faint dragging noises through the snow, stopping and starting in no clear pattern. Malone shifted uneasily beside me. "They're out there, watching." I didn't argue, I felt it too. We kept the fire small and our rifles close. Sleep came only in fits, and every time I drifted off, I dreamed of the frozen soldier by the boulder, his eyes open, staring past us at something we couldn't see. When I woke before dawn, the fire had died to embers. A thin mist had crept up the ridge, and the snow at the edge of the trench was marked by new tracks. Not boots. Bare footprints, too small, too many, circling our camp like a ring. The morning light barely touched the ridge. It seeped through the mist in weak strands that did little to warm us. The bare footprints around our trench had partially filled with new snow overnight, but their shape was still visible, small, almost childlike, each toe outlined sharp against the frost. No one spoke as we packed up camp. We just moved carefully, as though any noise might invite whatever had circled us to come closer. The trail we'd been following forked here. One path led down the far slope toward a stand of black pines, the other veered east toward a line of rocky outcrops. Reed crouched to study the ground. "They went east," he said. "2 sets of tracks. Still fresh." Malone's voice cracked slightly. "That means they were here last night, while we slept." The words hung in the cold air like breath. We took the eastern trail, moving slower now, scanning the trees for movement. The snow had thinned enough that patches of damp earth showed through, scattered with fragments of webbing straps, a snapped ammo clip, and at one point the torn corner of a field map half buried in slush. By mid-morning we reached a clearing at the foot of the rocks. There we found the second missing soldier. He was sprawled face down beside the remnants of another campfire, his rifle a few feet away. The snow around him melted into a dark, frozen stain. When we turned him over, we saw no bullet wounds again, no shrapnel. His lips were bluish, his eyes half open. Reed knelt beside the body, his brow furrowed. "Looks like exposure, but his gear's intact. Why'd he drop his weapon?" No one had an answer. We buried him quickly as we had the first, marking the spot with a branch stripped of bark. It felt wrong, leaving men like this in unmarked graves, but there was no choice. That left one man still unaccounted for. The final set of tracks led higher into the rocks. We climbed after them, the ground slick beneath our boots, the air colder the higher we went. At one point the path narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for a man to pass sideways. We hugged the stone face, inching across while the wind clawed at our jackets. On the other side we found a small hollow in the rock, a natural shelter half hidden by fallen branches. A spent flare casing lay near the entrance. Reed motioned for us to spread out, covering angles as we stepped inside. The last soldier was there. He was seated against the stone wall, knees drawn up, his helmet resting on the ground beside him. His eyes were closed, but his face bore a strange expression. Not fear, not peace. Something caught between the two. His hands still clutched the receiver of a radio that no longer worked. Carter whispered, "He looks like he was waiting for someone to answer." Reed examined him for wounds and found nothing. No sign of struggle. His canteen was full, his rations barely touched. Malone's voice was barely a murmur. What happened to them? No one spoke. The silence in that hollow felt heavier than the rock above us. We buried the last of the missing squad at the edge of the hollow, marking the grave with his own bayonet driven into the frozen earth. By the time we made our way back down the ridge, the snowfall had started again, soft flakes settling on our packs and erasing the trail behind us. None of us spoke during the return march. There was nothing to say. We had found them, all but their answers. That night, back at the logging camp, Reed sent a brief report over the radio. "Recovered remains of missing patrol, cause undetermined. No enemy contact observed. No enemy contact." The words sounded wrong even as he said them, but there was no better explanation to give. I sat apart from the others by the dying embers of the fire, staring into the dark beyond the camp. Somewhere out there, the snow was still falling on 3 shallow graves, and I knew we'd never speak of them again. Back at the base, the 3 names went on the roster as recovered deceased, non-combat causes. That was the official line. No mention of the strange tracks in the snow, the missing rounds never fired, the uneaten rations, the look frozen on each of their faces. The report Reed typed was brief, clinical. I remember watching the words appear on the page and thinking how small they looked compared to the weight they carried. That night in the barracks, Malone asked if we should tell the chaplain what we'd really seen. The tracks, the fire still warm when we found the first man. The way the last one sat like he'd been listening to voices that weren't there. Reed didn't look up from his boots. "There's nothing to tell," he said. "Nothing that would change what happened." Carter muttered that it wasn't right, that their families deserved the truth. But the truth was a fog we couldn't put into words. And none of us wanted to sound crazy. In the days that followed, the winter closed in harder. We got new orders, another patrol in another sector, and the silence about that squad became part of the routine. We carried it the same way we carried our rifles, a weight you didn't question because questioning didn't change anything. Years later, I still see them sometimes in dreams. The snow-covered ridge, the child-sized prints circling the trench, the last soldier holding the radio to his ear as if someone might still answer. I never spoke about them after the war. Not to my wife, not to my kids, not even at reunions with other vets. Some stories stay buried because digging them up feels like tempting them back. But now I'm old and I know what silence can cost. If we don't tell these stories, they vanish, and the men who lived and died inside them vanish too. So I tell it here. For them. For the ones we buried under thin branches and frozen soil. For the patrol whose story never made it into the history books. If you've stayed with me to the end of this memory, thank you. These aren't easy stories to share, but they deserve to be heard. If you want to hear more voices like mine, more accounts that never made the headlines but shaped the lives of the men who served, subscribe, leave a comment, and keep these stories alive. Some ghosts stay in the places they fell. Some stay in the men who walked away. And some will follow you home in the silence between the years.